20 years ago, when Yu-Gi-Oh is still in its infancy and the game was much slower, mystical Space Typhoon, which is just a simple quick play spell that can destroy a spell or trap on the field, were an absolute staple in every single deck. But as time went on and the game got faster and faster, the cards slowly fell into the pit of obscurity. Now, over 20 years after its initial release, mystical Space Typhoon finally made its way back into the meta. All it took is an entire new archetype that built around it, Radiant Typhoon. Released in the physical card game in the Doom of Dimension set at some time during the late 2025, this archetype finally made its way into masterduel in March of 2026 with the Drastic Storm pack. With its underlying theme based around mystical Space Typhoon, this archetype consists entirely out of wind attribute monsters and quick play spells that all reference this iconic card. As of now, there are a total of 12 Radiant Typhoon cards, 6 main deck monsters, 4 quick play spells, 1 link monster, and 1 continuous trap. The main deck Radiant Typhoon monsters are divided into 2 groups, the low-level monsters and the high-level monsters, which will have different summoning condition. The low-level monsters, which are all level 3, can be special summoned from your hand if your opponent controls no spell or trap, or you have a mystical Space Typhoon in your graveyard. This condition makes this monster essentially free to summon if you're going first, and also they doesn't activate in the hand to summon themselves, which means they will not activate cards like Izuna or Dominus Spiral. In contrast, the high-level Radiant Typhoon monsters will activate in the hand to special summon themselves if any quick play spell is activated except during the damage step. So keep that in mind if you do want to play around the previously mentioned cards or other cards with similar activation requirement. Another thing to note about these monsters is that they will activate to summon themselves in a separate chain after the quick play spell has resolved, and you can only activate one of these effects in the same chain, so you cannot summon 2 or more of these monsters from your hand at the same time. In terms of their purpose, these monsters generally have 2 roles in Radiant Typhoon. They are either the searchers of the deck, or they provide disruption and board control while they are on the field. Swan and Eldon are your basic searchers that tutor for a Radiant Typhoon spell or trap, or a Radiant Typhoon monster respectively, and each alternatively can also search for an MST. On the other hand, Magala and Crosea have a bigger tutor effect, but they are harder to use. Magala can straight up special summon any Radiant Typhoon monster from your deck, but you will need to successfully activate a Radiant Typhoon quick play spell or an MST to trigger it. And in the case of Crosea, it can search for up to 2 cards when it is summoned, but you will need to have a quick play spell if you want to summon this card from your hand, or if you want to summon it from your deck with Magala itself. Using either of these effects will lock you into wind monster for the rest of the turn, which does limit Radiant Typhoon potential to mix with other archetypes, or at least with these 2 monsters specifically. As for the last 2 Radiant Typhoon monsters, they can both provide a pretty powerful disruptive effect while they are on the board, as long as you can fulfill their activation requirement. The key thing about these 2 monsters is that they can be special summoned from your grave if any player activates a mystical Space Typhoon. This is an important effect for the long game, and one of the deck main synergy for running mystical Space Typhoon. Now for the other main part of Radiant Typhoon, the quick play spells. These all have a pretty simple effect to help you advance your game plan, either by being a consistency piece, or to help you trigger your other Radiant Typhoon monster effects. Radiant Typhoon Vision can draw you 2 cards, but you will have to discard a Radiant Typhoon or quick play spells, otherwise you will lose your entire hand. Radiant Typhoon Chain can tutor for a level 4 or lower Radiant Typhoon monster. Radiant Typhoon Manifestation can send a Radiant Typhoon monster from your deck to the graveyard. And Radiant Typhoon Ascendant can reborn a level 6 or lower Radiant Typhoon monster from the grave. Aside from that, all of these spells have a secondary effect to add a mystical Space Typhoon from your deck or graveyard to your hand. This effect is especially important if you're going second, because just by having a mystical Space Typhoon in your graveyard, you can special summon your low-level Radiant Typhoon monster from your hand. The extra nice thing about these spells is that you can use both of their effects in the same turn, in case you happen to have multiple copies of the same card in your hand. One last effect that is shared between these spells is that if they are being destroyed by the effect of mystical Space Typhoon, you can set them to your field. Yes, sometimes you will need to MST your own cards in order to trigger the effects of your Radiant Typhoon monsters. Having this effect on your spells ensures that you won't randomly go minus from doing so, and you will also gain value by essentially recycling your spells to be used during your next turn. This effect also doesn't have a hard once per turn restriction on them either, so it can be triggered as many times as you want during a turn, something to keep in mind especially in the mirror match. Still, you don't really want to use MST on your own card too often though, because they will generally have more value in your hand to be paired with the next card, Radiant Typhoon Mandate. This is the key synergy and payoff piece of Radiant Typhoon that really ties this entire archetype together. Every time a mystical Space Typhoon is activated, you can chain Mandate directly to it to target and negate a face-up card your opponent control. So, the more MST you can use, the more times you can negate with Mandate. provided that your opponent doesn't gently block it with their own quick effects. Mandate also have a really powerful recycle effect that on its off once per turn can target and shuffle back 3 quick play spells from your grave, including a Radiant Typhoon card to draw a card from your deck and give your wind monster a small stat boost for the turn. Getting this trap on your field will be the job of the Link monster Varurun, which can play it from your deck or graveyard face up on your field if a quick play spell is activated. You can do this both on your turn and on your opponent's turn, so with some careful planning, you can definitely make more use out of your mandate than you normally would be able to. Aside from that, the card can also add an extra MST to your hand, and also it can act as a form of removal, pushing a monster your opponent control into the back row. And that is the entire set of Radiant Typhoon for now. The Archetype has a pretty straightforward play pattern within itself. You don't really play for any exuberant combo. Most of your cards is just there to tutor for more Radiant Typhoon and MST from your deck, and you mostly just rely on your mandate and your high-level Radiant Typhoon monsters as your main form of these options. The thing that I really love about this is that it really put MST in the front and center of the deck, making it a key point of interaction in the deck rather than just something being done for flavor. And it's also not a meme archetype either. Radiant Typhoon definitely have enough power in itself to be a competitive strategy without needing the help from other archetypes. One of the biggest strengths of Radiant Typhoon is its inbuilt back row removal capability, with almost every single card in the archetype can search for an MST. So you're definitely gonna have an advantage against decks that rely on the continuous spell or traps. Also, because of the interaction with Mandate that allows you to negate any card that MST is targeting, it's gonna be a nightmare for any spell-based deck to go second against Radiant Typhoon. Another strong thing about this archetype is that it had an incredible resource engine and recursion power. For sure, this is definitely not a unique thing to have in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, but it is still a very powerful aspect of the deck that not every single archetype can do. With Mandate ability to recycle your cards, and your high-level Radiant Typhoon monster can summon themselves from the graveyard, you will virtually never run out of resources unless your opponent can banish this card from the game. Another cool thing about Radiant Typhoon is that because you don't really have a hard combo you need to follow in this deck, you can very easily modify your play pattern depending on the game state. The Radiant Typhoon cards that doesn't have a restriction on them is also very splashable in other decks as well. Swan and Eldem are essentially free special summon from your hand if you're going first, so they are a perfect fit for any deck that care about level 3 monsters, like Goblin Backer or Material Reactor for example. They can also be used in the Yummy archetype thanks to the bridge provided by the Tri-Brigade cards that can search for any Beast or Beast Warrior monster from your deck, which is what both Yummy and Radiant Typhoon monsters are. Of course, the most flexible Radiant Typhoon card is the Radiant Typhoon Vision that can go in just about any deck that have a lot of quick play spells. From Skyshaker to Runic to Purely to Memento to Mitsurugi, and even something that can benefit from heavy cycle like Tenpai can now use a card like Vision, which means of course that this card gets the yugioh tags in masterduel. Okay, moving on, let's discuss some cards that you can play in your deck that will synergize with your Radiant Typhoon engine. Shina, Twin Tempest of Celestial Thunder, that was released in the same pack, is a very powerful generic wind support that can wipe either all monster on the board or all spell trap on the field. It can be used as a board clear, as a form of disruption, or to dodge an opponent effect. It's not always gonna be usable, but it is a very high impact card that it is gonna be worth 1 or 2 slots in your deck for it. Noble Knight Shield Bearer is a simple search for Radiant Typhoon Eldem if you need more consistency in your deck. Copy Fatal Storm is a complete blowout card for Radiant Typhoon and can be activated if you control a Crosseia. You can also consider running the Hoppy Conductor to use the Fatal Storm directly from your hand during your turn. This is obviously a very cheesy card, and Radiant Typhoon definitely don't really need this to win. But why not just use and abuse it as long as it exists in the game? Part of Extravagant is the go-to part to use in Radiant Typhoon. The win lock on your monster means that you will not have a lot of extra deck options to go into anyway, so it is fine to lose a few cards from it for a card that is very likely to make ash from the opponent. Dominus Purge and Dominus Spiral will be your go-to hand trap if you're looking for more turn 1 disruptions that will not trigger effects like Izuna for example, and also doesn't prevent you from using the Wind attribute. One of the main weaknesses of Radiant Typhoon is definitely its lack of interactions with monsters. So cards like Forbidden Droplet and Super Polymerization, which are high impact quick play spells that can help cover this weakness of the archetype, is gonna be very crucial for the success of the deck. You can play either one or both of them, or at least some other alternatives that fulfill a similar role, like Book of Eclipse for example if you want a cheaper option. Dark Ruler No More is also another board breaker that I find to be really good in certain metas, even though it is not a quick play spell. So you can definitely expose some other cards in similar vein as well, because this deck can definitely tolerate this kind of cards. Looking forward to the future, cards like the Fallen and the Virtuous and the Forbidden Crown are also high impact quick play spells that can come in and slot in perfectly in this deck. Here is an example of a decklist for an early build of Radiant Typhoon that I am using in the replay portion of this video. I do use a couple more Radiant Typhoon spells than usual because I do find myself wanting to see them more often in my hand. But aside from that, this is still a pretty standard list for the most part. The only big card that I'm not using here is the Hobby Feather Storm, just because of my personal preference that the card turns off a lot of interaction with the opponent and is a very one-dimensional card. But you can still very easily slot in this card if you want. You can just take out a couple of Radiant Typhoon spells, or going over 40 cards is also fine. I have even seen some lists that completely cut out Ash Blossom. The Archetype though is definitely the saddest part about this deck. When you're even using a card like Gracefly, unironically, you know you're definitely scraping the bottom of the barrel here. So there is a lot of room for improvisation up in here. You can play more super poly targets, like Draco's Sepelia or Secretariat Dragon. But the real answer here is probably just waiting for new and better cards to come and fill in these slots. Overall, I do feel like this list is a great starting point if you're starting out with Radiant Typhoon. It also doesn't have as big of a UR requirement as some of the other recent meta decks either. Only a minimum of 8 URs from the Drastic Storm pack, 3 Eldon, 3 Vision, 1 Phonic, and 1 Sheena is enough. You can play more Sheena if you pull more, but it is really not necessary. And to close out the video, I have a few tips for you before you start your Radiant Typhoon journey. The number one tip for playing with Radiant Typhoon is that it is almost always beneficial for you to trigger your effects in the draw phase. This is a key piece of gameplay for the deck to play around hand traps like Draw and Lockbird and Effect Veiler that cannot be activated in the draw phase. If you have a high level Radiant Typhoon monster in your hand and you have an activatable quick play spell, then you definitely should use it immediately to get this monster out on the field right away because they will have high impact on the board. But if you don't have this monster in your hand, then it is kinda depend whether you want to use your quick play spell in the draw phase or not. If you already have your starter monster, Swan and Eldon, then I would generally hold off on using the quick play spell because you can always chain them to Draw and Lockbird, and this spell can be useful later in the turn, or you can always hold them as a follow-up. But yeah, if you don't have this monster in your hand, then you should activate your searchers in the draw phase, specifically Radiant Typhoon Vision and Chen. The one rule that I always follow is that I always keep an activatable quick play spell that is not an MST in order to trigger Magala or Varurun later in the turn. The ability to trigger your effects in the draw phase is also very valuable for when you're going second, because a lot of effects will not be able to trigger until the main phase. But you definitely need to have a more careful planning of your turn before you start activating your effects. Now let's talk about chaining blocking with MST. This is not something you can do every single game, but if you can do it, then you probably should do it to protect your opponent effects against hand traps like Ash or Bell. If you are in a situation where you can summon a Crocea, either by having it in your hand when you are using a quick play spell, or in this example, by using Ascendant to summon it from your graveyard. Now you will need to chain an MSC to destroy the Ascendant, or if you are summoning the Crocea from your hand, you will need to chain another Radiant Typhoon spell to the Crocea itself, and then chain the MSC to destroy that spell. Then when the Crocea is summoned to your field, you can now activate both the monster effect and the effect of the spell in your grave to reset itself in the same chain. Now all you need to do is put the Crocea on the lower chain link and the spell effect on the higher chain link. And that is how you can chain and block with MST. Yet another thing that MST can do in 2026, what can this card do? A small tip for when you're going second is prioritizing searching for a MST with your Radiant Typhoon spell if your opponent have a back row set up to help summon your low level Radiant Typhoon monster. But again, you should be more strategic about this. If you can search an MST throughout the ways, like with your Crocea or with your Varurun, then you can save your spell for other effects. You can see more of the deck in action in the replay portion of this video that is coming up. But in conclusion, I would say that Radiant Typhoon is a very strong archetype that have a pretty straightforward gameplay and it is easy to pilot. It have a very solid core with a lot of consistency piece and one of the stronger non-engine support. The deck itself doesn't have a very high ceiling of disruptions if you don't combo it with some other archetypes, but it is really a testament to how good the deck can be, even without needing that much help. There is still of course a lot of weak points to the deck, like for example the deck cannot deal with any graveyard based effects, and it is also very weak to having the card banish. With all of that being said, I would say that this deck is in a very solid spot in the meta. It is not a highly competitive deck, but it definitely can compete with the best of the best. The archetype is also in a pretty sweet spot, where it is very unlikely to get hit in the ban list unless Vision become a highly popular card, but that is also pretty unlikely. This is also a pretty good investment for the future too, because of how technical some of these cards are. Mystical Space Typhoon is the first ever retro Yu-Gi-Oh card that has this big of a resurgence in the meta, thanks to an entirely new archetype that built around it. And while the success of this archetype definitely is something that is very exciting, it does make you wonder which retro Yu-Gi-Oh card can get this treatment next. I, for one, would be pretty hyped about a Torrento Tribute archetype. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you next time!